So, yeah, thanks so much for coming, Peter.
Of course.
It's a huge privilege for me to have such a fantastic player on track, and I think you really brought it to life. And normally, obviously, when we were doing the actual session, I would have talked to you about what the scene is about and all that sort of thing. But now, as you know it, we didn't have to talk about that in front of camera. But how important is that for you, do you think, to know what the scene is about and everything before you get started?
I mean, I think it makes a huge difference. And you're trying to, you've written music in response to a scene, and then I'm going to try and play your music. It does help to know. Obviously, I think when you hear the music, you realise quite quickly it's not going to be, it's not happy. I mean, it might have an optimistic turn, but it's it's serious. But I think it does make a difference, and it's nice. You feel more. Feel more not invested in it, but
part of the project.
You feel more part. You feel part of the project, but you feel, you might just say something that clicks with something else.
How that should physically be played.
I mean,
according to what that emotion is.
If you were saying, oh, it's a very fast, factual scene, you might do a quite clean bow change. You might go ding, 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 or something like that. If you say, oh, it's a long panning shot discovery, you might try and elongate everything as much as you can. You never know. I think from a composer point of view, you would never know what little word you might say that might tip the edge with the performer to just make the magic happen.
Good to know, and kind of brings me to my other question, which is, if someone doesn't know how to write necessarily notation, but because nowadays people are using MIDI all the time, and I use MIDI all the time, and I find it sometimes easier to just read a MIDI roll than to read the score.
Totally.
Then can they still use your services as a session cellist if they don't have experience with that sort of thing?
Yes. I mean, it's not. I don't think you would expect everyone to be just sent a piano roll, but I certainly. Personally, I actually find it quite quick to just be sent an unquantized MIDI file, in that, if you're saying that if you don't, if the composer doesn't know how to read or write music, notation music, but they've still programmed it, they've still got it with the mod wheel, they've got their CC 102 or whatever the vibrato is, they've got all everything kind of mapped out and everything looks right in the MIDI world. That's more than instructive enough for me to then sit and work through it.
You know what the intentions are.
I would rather not be sent in kind of messy crotchets and quavers, because actually when you quantize those, if you don't know what you're looking at, to someone who does know what they're looking at, it can be wildly off. And it can be,
there are too many interpretations.
It can be quite obstructive. Things like, is it a C sharp or is it a D flat? So as a string player or as a singer, that has an implication. So if it's a C sharp in an A major chord, so the third going up to a D, you'll want that C sharp to be really quite bright. But if it's
by bright, you mean slightly
sharp,
up,
a little sharp, not so much as to overpower a tuning algorithm, but just enough so it's called a leading note. It's likewise, if it was a D flat falling to a C, you might want that D flat, although the same keyboard note, we might want to make it just a bit flatter, just to make it fall and sink down.
In that sense, do you find if you're playing with a piano or something that has a very tempered fixed tuning, then does that affect those decisions?
No, not so much, because I think it's all still part of the expression. It's just another one of the flavours in the cake. You've got kind of bow position, vibrato, string choice, you've got all sorts of things, and actually kind of creative intonation is a really expressive tool, just sort of pushing it in, pulling it back. And
it's what gives it the life that we're looking so much for.
Because I always feel with samples, when we're programming samples, it's, you zoom out and it's got to sound like the cue, but really what you're doing is you're trying to make a circle with a million straight lines. If you zoom in, it's still matchsticks, it's still lots of little things. And what we're doing when we put a real cello or a choir or an orchestra, whatever it is you've suddenly got a real circle. And it's just it rounds it all out. And, it does hopefully just add that breath back in where it's maybe been, quantized down for sensible reasons, but then you can maybe just let it breathe again.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think everyone can hear that. Do you are there any kind of microphone techniques or ways that you would, when layering cellos up like this? I was saying this earlier, that I find that there are certain frequencies that build up, and that you're making life harder for the mix engineer later.
Yeah.
Is there a way that we can make it easier further down the line?
To be honest, I mean, for me, I find with every instrument will be different. Every cello will be different. Violins, violas, whatever. There's no kind of blanket rule. I mean, I saw you do it on the bus, and they're just taking out some of that low end, which after a while will compound and become a kind of my cello is quite it's got quite a bit in the kind of 1K kind of region.
That's not uncommon, I don't think.
It's not. Yeah. It's not. So I would just take a little notch out on that on each thing. Actually, the preamp I use in my studio has a rumble filter on it. It's one of these Chandler mic cassettes, and it's got a rumble filter. I just notch up if I'm tracking. I don't if I'm doing a straight line, but if I'm tracking, I'll notch something. It's quite subtle, but it does help. So
if you're just doing a single melody line or something, you wouldn't do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends which hat or how many hats you're wearing. I think if I'm recording as a remote session cellist for something, for you, for example, you're obviously a very accomplished mix engineer. But what I would sort of stop and think, well, which hat am I wearing? Am I delivering finished final audio, or am I sending part of the process? And actually, with so much of this music, the mix is such a creative process. I think, well, I'm probably not going to overcommit to this is a very pure cello sound, because maybe they want the woofy low rumble, maybe they want the sinewy top stuff. I don't, if I send everything, they can do what they like. Yeah. It does change when you're tracking, because it becomes obstructive. But I think, to actually answer your question rather than just ramble on, microphone techniques, it depends on the room, it depends on the instruments. By and large, something pointing down at the instrument. I like to go up high and down, more like you would see for a violin. Yeah. If you're in a big orchestral session, generally the cello microphones will be down low. Closer
to the F-holes.
It's close, sort of down here, the sort of low-end resonance. I personally put it...
Projects in this way.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're sitting, the sound's going up, it's not going down. So I would like, not being a recording engineer, I know enough to record my cello in my room.
I find that if you just use your ear, and just something as simple as these little movements, and it's go subtle, where it sounds the way you want it to sound.
A lot of rooms are quite. I mean, we're very lucky in Paul's old room that it's got a nice thing to it. My studio, I have these diffusers that have been built. These, we've seen them, the 4-foot things.
They're great,
and they're really nice. They just add a bit of life back around an otherwise deadened room.
When we did this, we did it in Pixel, your old studio.
Yes.
And we used a U47 in the configuration you described, which was
close,
lower. And then we had an Aria, Sontronics Aria above.
And then I think we had Royers at the back of the room.
We had a couple of Royers in the back. So we, just to give that differentiation between the different lines, to have a bit more option in the mix.
And I think, but from a very simple, I think if you're, as a composer, you're great. I mean, first of all, the music's, you're great. No, the music's lovely, the music's beautiful. It's very clear what you're, it's got clear signposts of, here's a moment, here's a thing. It's not just never-ending suspension, release, suspension, suspension. There's a clear kind of line through the music. That's not always appropriate, it's not always desirable, but in this cue, it's quite clear where you're aiming for. I'm guilty of it too, but very rarely people put in sort of descriptive, or they don't think of the score like a map and think, well, you're starting here and you're going there, but functionally you're just going left, right. You do still need to have a sense of phrasing, a sense of dynamic shape. Are we getting louder here? We're going quieter there. Where's the roundabout? What's going to be the problem in this? Yeah. And I think it's difficult as a composer to remember that. You've sat and spent so much time with it. You're like, well, of course, it's going to bar 46. Yeah. Whereas if Joe Bloggs...
You're seeing it for the first time.
You're sitting in, you're just thinking... The reality is, you know, when you get sent stems, if I'm sent, you know, I don't know, 45 cues for a film, you don't have time to listen through the MIDI mock-up demo stem. You just don't have time. So I'll just open up the MIDI and see what automation's in place, or the score if it's been annotated. But if you're tracking, I think, you know, maybe a good trick that I've come across is that there's a kind of an aesthetic thing to consider, which is there are two end results of tracking one instrument, and you've got to make a decision. You've got to commit to the decision at the beginning. Are we trying to make it sound like 4 people playing in one room at a time, or are we trying to make it sound like one person playing 4 times? And it sounds a little bit obtuse, but the difference is huge. You know, if you're trying to create an illusion of a real quartet, you're going to pan it differently. You're going to change frequencies on things. I've got a couple of different bows. You might move microphones. You might do any number of things. But if the idea is to have a ultra unified sound, you're not going to do that.
Yeah.
But the one thing you probably will have to think about is vibrato. And everyone has although you probably don't like to admit it, everyone does have a kind of default. Here's my wide vibrato, here's my narrow, and it's, you know, it's kind of a natural
we're all
speed.
different, and you do how you do it.
And to be aware of different vibration speeds for different voices, regardless of whether you're trying to make it sound like 4 people playing once or one person playing 4 times, you still don't want the vibratos to line up bang on the clock, because it's otherwise going to be the same instrument in the same room on the same microphone, oscillating in the same way, and it's just going to sound like...
And the benefit of having an experienced session musician come in and do that for us is that that's something we don't even have to worry about. It's just something you build into your performance by default.
Yeah, and it's obviously, you know, when you're playing in a section, you're trying to unify your play. You're trying to play with each other, but because there are 12 of you, 10 of you, there's a natural difference that just happens, and the sounds are hitting different corners of the room, and it's, you know, there's a sort of erratic nature to that, which in a room like this, you know, in a small controlled sound, you kind of have to create those things. Not, I don't know if you saw or you can hear it, but in the silences, it's not stopping dead. You know, I know in Paul and Christian's videos, they always talk about why they leave, you know, sort of the release down, and string players will always sort of fade and dim al niente at the end of a bow. But there's always noise in the middle of a thing, and so I always try, unless it's kind of obviously wrong, but you always try and keep some kind of sound alive in a bar's rest, even if it's just the bow moving kind of silently.
That's interesting. Just to give
keep that life going. You know, even supposing running it into however many nice, lovely reverbs, there's still then functional silence. Where there wouldn't have been that in a live recording. It would still have had air in the room, reflections in the sound, and so I was trying to just keep something kind of ticking along.
That's really interesting. That's great. I think that the two situations that you talk about, where you're either this is the sound that we're going for, or sometimes you'll use the instrument to supplement samples to make them sound more realistic. That's another way you get called in, right? Yes,
to sort of overdub, underdub, whatever the preferred phrase is, but to supplement, as you say, supplement samples. And there are some complications with that. You know, obviously the way samples are made, it's note at a time, they're tuned, they're mapped to a keyboard, it's quite a mechanical, however beautiful sounding they are. So then it does become tricky to do this kind of expressive intonation thing. That does become a little bit of an issue, and there are ways around it. You know, if you're going to be tuning things, which often you just have to make it all like you quantize. It's just got to be on the grid. You can change sensitivities. You know, you don't want all of them to start to kind of phase horribly. If you had 2 different Fs and they are precisely the same. You know, so I will often soften the tuning speed or reduce it, increase it, change the sensitivity by a cent here or there, just to kind of fluff it up a bit.
That's great.
But yeah, I mean, I think with that, one one experience I did have with, sorry to speak over you.
No, no, no.
One experience I had with that, which would be my kind of cautionary tale about augmenting samples with a live instrument, is once it's been done, don't move the goalposts. So I was working on a project with a composer, and it was a lot of cues. I mean, really a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got this slightly short message, and I said, "Oh, you know, just checking it was all okay." And it was sort of 40-something cues, tracked, lots of notes, lots of everything. And he said, "Yeah, well, I had to go and retune everything." Oh, really? Because I thought, "Oh, it's kind of left me all right." So what? I think. And he said, "Well, I changed sample library, and it just didn't fit." I thought, well,
Oh, wow.
kind of to be expected, I would think, but that was a cautionary tale. You've got to. I think
it shows that it matters, that
it
you're
does
really
show, yeah,
performing with that
and
particular
you've got
arrangement.
to be aware that it's not going to be. It's not another, you know, mechanical process. By the time you've sent it out, maybe don't be changing. It would be like changing the rhythm and saying, "Oh, you played out of time."
Yeah.
The intonation of these things is so crucial, especially on these, you know, unfretted, kind of free range instruments.
Yeah, of course.
It's such a kind of key part of the expressive toolkit that maybe the fault is on me or people like me who didn't explain that, or it hasn't been explained. Because I suppose there isn't really a reason why you would think that, you know, if you weren't in on the trick. But it is such an important, you know, think of the great opera singers, you know, they can make you cry by just holding it just a bit low. It's not out of tune, but it's all part of that thing, you know, and it's, yeah, I think it's a really important thing to be aware of, that treat pitch, treat the tuning, treat the samples or whatever, treat the tuning that you're sending out as importantly as you do the rhythm. You wouldn't expect someone to then be blamed if you then change a pattern of rhythms.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's really interesting. And by hearing you say things like that, you know, we are getting the word out there more as well. So that's really good.
Yeah, hopefully.
Do you ever find yourself in a situation, this is a good chance for you to plug your own library with Spitfire. Do you ever find yourself in a situation where you would use a sample rather than just sit down and play it?
Yeah.
Is this a tricky question?
No, it's not a tricky question. Yeah, there are a couple of things on the, it's called electric, so the electric cello library, PP13, I think, the producer portfolio,
Okay,
something like that.
yeah.
Anyway,
I love it. I use it all the time.
Well, so do I.
Yeah.
I say that in the least conceited. Well, I mean, I've got the same cello at home. It's the same.
Yeah,
you know, we did it all with the same signal chain. But there are some things which are actually quite tricky to record. The bowed colegnos on it, I think, are pretty good. The harmonics are pretty good.
And there's some tuning stuff as well.
Yeah,
you
there's
don't
some
want to change
cool.
the tuning all the time.
Yeah,
on the
because
cello.
it's a mechanical cello. It's got machine heads like a guitar. You can control it really, really well. So we spent a bunch of time doing that.
Great.
It does make life easier when I'm working with people. If I'm they send me it's like, well, I know what that is. I know what this is. It does make life easier because I did it. And it does feel, you know, I think the real kind of the crown on for me with that library is it's not just a DI'd electric cello. You know, we mic'd it up quite extravagantly. So you really get all that bow noise and bow hit. It's like you're in the room with it. And so that's nice, you know, when you hear that come back in, you think, oh, it does feel more like a performance. It feels more like it's in that room. So, yeah, it does, you know, I've played on a bunch. I was doing a Spitfire session this morning.
Oh, yeah.
And it is interesting sitting there when I'm playing, writing, thinking, oh, it might be like this. But when you're sitting playing it, thinking, oh, how might I use it? How will this be mapped? How will this be used?
Yeah, it's great. There's definitely a place now where they meet, where the quality of the samples is so good that you're thinking, how can I supplement the real with the samples? How can I supplement the samples with the real? Yeah. And it becomes this really interesting puzzle, I think.
Yeah.
We do that in this cue, you know, with the Albion stuff sneaking underneath it. And it gives a body to it that you're not going to get in a room like this.
Yeah, yes, exactly. It's got that expanse, it's got the rumble and the kind of stuff. I think, obviously this cue doesn't have any of it, but the hardest thing in a blending, augmenting thing is short notes,
Mm-hmm.
is trying to match those just because the way that the noise floor in a studio, you have to keep it low.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas actually doing these fast off-string bowing techniques, it's quite noisy.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, think, oh, do I need to clip it so that it's clipped like the sample, or do I do it so it's long and then it doesn't blend? And
Mm-hmm.
so some kind of interesting aesthetic questions there.
Yeah.
But I've certainly noticed on sessions being asked to do certain techniques more like this, more like that. You know, well, it's almost at a point, I think, where it needs a new name. You know, it's like a kind of a hybrid technique.
Play like the sample.
Yeah, it's not quite staccato, it's not quite spiccato, but it's the sound that we're hearing all the time, and it's marked as one, but the result of the marking is not always the most accurate description of that sound.
Do you think that is a product of people taking the things that you guys play in and then editing them later to match the samples, or is it in the performance, or is it a combination of the processing? And
I think it's a nature of needing silence after the fact. So you do a hit, you go, you need the silence for it not just to be a ho ho.
I understand. Yeah,
I think
it's the resonance, natural resonance,
of the instrument and the natural resonance of the room, all of which are hugely desirable facets of a sound.
Yeah,
unless
but
you're
in that particular situation,
exactly.
Okay,
and it's become a kind of aesthetic thing, you know, with all the round robining, if that's the correct phrase. It doesn't sound like Machine Gun Fire, and people don't play them going down, 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 down. You know, people are playing them down, up, down. So there is variety and there's a shape to it. You know, like you say, like there's capturing a performance in a sample. But I think it will be interesting in 10 years' time or something, now that everything has been everything is so well recorded and codified, but still using terms to describe an acoustic unmapped performance. So I think it'll be quite interesting to see if actually it's beneficial to simply come up with a new word for it's specifically this hybrid staccato spiccato thing.
I'm sure other situations will arise too, where you need these kind of in scoring situations, particularly where you're going to need to have these kind of the conductors will need to know what to call it.
All these grids, all these evolving sounds. You know, how you notate that is a really interesting challenge, and not one to be glossed over in, you know, answering questions about cello recording. But it's an interesting, when you sit and look at a page, you sit and look at a piece of paper, it makes such a difference if you look at it and think, oh, this makes sense to me because of this amount of training. If you look at it and think, all hinges on the confidence of thinking, does this make sense? And it's a very roundabout way of saying, supplementing samples is doable.
No, but it's super interesting, and I feel like something I had no idea about. So that's great. Thanks so much for the beautiful playing.
Anytime.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.